Questions of much graver and universal interest occupy our minds today.
Hello, my name is Eric Shine, Lieutenant Eric Shine. I'm a graduate of the United States Merchant Marine Academy at Kings Point. It's a sister academy to West Point and Annapolis, the Air Force Academy, and also in a indirect way, the Coast Guard Academy. As a graduate of Kings Point, I come out with a naval commission and serve as an officer in the United States Merchant Marine as a Federal Maritime Officer. My employment as a Federal Maritime Officer counts for my naval commission. We have a naval commission coming out of Kings Point and serving in the United States Merchant Marine so that in times of national emergency and or war, our naval commission can be activated and we can act as a liaison to the United States Navy under a declared war by Congress. I'm here to talk to you today about some larger issues first and foremost. It goes to some of the issues of not the neocons, or like I like to call them, the Nerocons or the Eurocons, because much of this is not about America. It is not about democracy. It is not about a limited republic. It is not about the sovereignty of our nation, or it is in fact, and in fact it is about dissolving that. And I also want to get in a little bit later into the Coast Guard and what they're up to and all of this. But there's an important book that I need to bring to your attention. This is one of the Bibles that the neocons use. It's called The Shield of Achilles by Philip Bobbitt, War, Peace, and the Course of History. And I want to get into real quick and read this one section. This is from part 3. It's page 211. And this goes into exactly what is going on. And they are trying to use, just as Napoleon did and just as Bismarck did, in their own time and within their own nation states, to change the constitutional order and use warfare, not just the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, but perpetual war, to rewrite the Constitution under warlike or national emergency conditions. And this is from Philip Bobbitt's book, and I'm reading directly from the book, The Historic Consequences of the Long War. And to be clear, the Long War, or this Long War, because there are several throughout history that are referred to as the Long War, is from 1914, the beginning of World War I, and 1990, when the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union as an empire, or as a republic, the USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, fell and fell apart thereafter. This is his thesis. The market state is superseding the nation state as consequence of the end of the Long War. And you have to be real careful or real clear on understanding what the nation state is and what the market state is, and how NAFTA and even recent comments by President Bush play into this. President Bush had said that because presidential candidate Barack Obama had come out and mentioned that he wanted to renegotiate NAFTA, and even now Hillary Clinton has chimed in as well. The warning came from President Bush that to renegotiate NAFTA would affect our national security infrastructure and agreements with Canada, which is kind of odd that the North American Free Trade Agreement would affect national security and international agreements with a neighboring nation state. This is an important paragraph, and it gets into exactly what is going on. I could not, in several hours, explain it better than Philip Bobbitt does here in this book, in this very short paragraph. The end of the Long War has been quickly followed by the emergence of a new constitutional order. This new form is the market state, whereas the nation state, with its mass-free public education, universal franchise, and Social Security policies promise to guarantee the welfare of the nation, the market state promises instead to maximize the opportunity of the people and thus tends to privatize many state activities and to make, listen to this, you'll like this, and to make many state activities and to make voting and representative government less influential and more responsive to the market. The United States, a principal innovator in the development of the market state, must fashion its strategic policies with this fundamental constitutional change in mind. So without actually having a constitutional convention where our elected representatives in both houses meet and convene and to decide on any constitutional changes, they're carrying on a constitutional change without our knowledge, unless you read quite a lot. There's a lot of other books, and I will mention them. Naomi Klein's book on the end of America, Naomi Klein's Shock Doctrine, Naomi Wolf's book, and I can't think of the title offhand. It's A Warning to a Patriot. Chalmers Johnson, his book called Nemesis. There's a lot of other books out there, including Philip Bobbitt. Not all these books are talking about the same thing, but when you read them and take them together, you start to understand what is going on is just like what happened in the former Soviet Union, where these individuals have decided, much like before Ronald Reagan came out and said, you know, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, that they were already selling off the nation state and privatizing it and taking enormous Commonwealth assets that we all own and control and passing them to private families, which goes into feudalism, kings and queens, and at some point they do end up pulling out the guillotines to maintain order. And what is going on here in the United States is a very same, if not identical, situation to where before the Republic falls and turns into what they would like to turn it into is the North American Union. And this says it. They've been out there and actually denounced and said that no, this issue of the North American Union is a myth. Well, right here, Philip Bobbitt, in his own text, and I have to point out where this individual studied, his own bio that is in the book. It bespeaks so much about the international and globalist and industrialist point of view that he and those that he deals with have. And let me read this from you, the book. It's Philip Bobbitt. This is his own, self-approved biography, The Shield of Achilles. Philip Bobbitt teaches constitutional law at the University of Texas. Texas. Where he holds the A.W. Walker Centennial Chair. And you've probably heard that name Walker before, like George Herbert Walker Bush. And Walker is a family that married into, or the Bushes married into, that goes way back. And you can do the lineage research online on that name and the family, and Samuel Bush and Prescott Bush. And I'm back to speaking about Philip Bobbitt. He was formerly the Anderson, and Anderson's another name. It's another family name that you can follow through history. Formerly the Anderson Senior Research Fellow at Nuffield College, Oxford University. And Oxford University is in England, where he was a member of the Modern History faculty. He was later the Marsh Christian Fellow in War Studies at King's College, University of London. There's some other people, and you have to be Oxford University. There's the Rhodes Scholarship, and former President Bill Clinton was a Rhodes Scholar. He studied for 3 years in England. And when you start to think of what our founding fathers would have thought of what is going on today in our nation and the issues of our own Declaration of Independence, they would be, and they probably are, turning over in their grave. He has served, and I'm back to speaking of Philip Bobbitt in his bio, he has served as an associate counsel to the President, legal counsel to the Senate Select Committee on the Iran-Contra affair, another red flag, the counselor on international law at the Department of State, as well as director of intelligence Senior Director for Critical Infrastructure, and Senior Director for Strategic Planning at the National Security Council. He has written several books on nuclear strategy, social choice, and constitutional law. He lives in Austin, Washington, and London. And I haven't made it all the way through the book, but it literally tells you, and I want to, I'm even going to read that paragraph again, just to be very clear, the historic consequences of the Long War. And again, the Long War is from 1914 to 1990, and this is by their own definitions. And this is the thesis. The market state is superseding the nation state as a consequence of the end of the Long War. So that means the United States, as we now know it, as a republic, as a constitutional republic, where we are under the rule of law, will soon be dissolved and married into this North American Union between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. This is not a myth. This is not a fable. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is actively and aggressively being pushed by certain individuals. And you have to understand why they want to do this. The Department of Defense alone owns and controls 66 million acres worldwide. And it's not just the land itself or the timber and other natural resources that rest upon that land, or the little critters that might be crawling around on that 66 million acres. It is also the natural resources and even access to other facilities and resources and geopolitical strategic places around the globe, but also the crude oil, the gold, the uranium, the copper, the silver that is underneath that 66 million acres. And when there is no more United States in name, basically a bankruptcy is carried out, whether it's traditional, whether it's declared or not, the United States is no more, just like the former Soviet Union. Anything and everything of the Commonwealth is up for grabs and will be sold off. And that is already going on right now here in the United States, much like what happened in the former Soviet Union before the wall fell and in 1990. And now they are taking down the country, not only selling off and seizing private and public assets, but there are some enormous structural changes going on in the federal government from behind the scenes that you're only hearing the tip of the iceberg about. And those are some of the things that I'm here to talk to you about today. But let me read this one last time, the paragraph about the end of the Long War and the market state. And again, this is from Philip Bobbitt's book, The Shield of Achilles. The end of the Long War has been quickly followed by the emergence of a new constitutional order. This new form is the market state, whereas the nation state, with its mass free public education, universal franchise, and social security policies, promise to guarantee the welfare of the nation. The market state promises instead to maximize the opportunity of the people, and thus tends to privatize many state activities and to make voting and representative government less influential and more responsive to the market. The United States, a principal innovator in the development of the market state, must fashion its strategic policies with this fundamental constitutional change in mind. And when you think about that second to last sentence, to make voting and representative government less influential, meaning that our representation, our representatives in Congress, our lobbying body are less influential in what goes on, and that they are, and the voters are, more responsive to the market rather than the market being more responsive to the voters and our representatives. And I want to, there's a good footnote in here also about Bismarck and Napoleon, about the majority of our legal code, not just here in the United States, but throughout the world, especially coming from Europe, is or has been established under not only Napoleon, but Bismarck as well. Here it is, I believe. It is not surprising that the principal legal codes of the world were introduced by the two greatest state builders of the 19th century, Napoleon and Bismarck. And this is being quoted from The Quality of Government, R.L. Porta. And this is a citation in his book. When you start to think of that and the gravity of what's going on and how war and warfare and being under a state of emergency or quote unquote, we're not even in a declared war as per Congress. There was an authorization to use force. And let me explain that an authorization to use force is not the same thing as a declaration of war. An authorization to use force would be like the Iran embassy siege, where the members of the embassy were actually taken hostage and held for, I think it was 450 some odd days. And to get them out and to get our citizens out and to protect the students, and this went on in Vietnam as well, that an authorization to use force to protect our citizens, to pull all the citizens and students and personnel out of the embassy and to protect them and to evacuate it, you can carry on or have Congress issue an authorization to use force. It's very limited in its scope. It's very targeted. It is not a declaration of war. And when you start to analyze everything that has gone on with Iraq, it's clear, because we didn't say that we were going in there because Iraq had attacked us or had anything to do with 9/11. We went in, we've heard many of the reasons. President Bush has said because he tried to kill my daddy. You could probably list about 20 other excuses of why to, quote unquote, cut off the head and take Saddam out because he was a threat, to take him out because he was a threat to his own people, to take him out because he was a dictator. All of these reasons to invade not only Iraq but also Afghanistan, and to push this war so that they can change the social contract, the constitutional order of not just Afghanistan and Iraq, and it looks to be soon to be Iran, but also here in the United States, and using warfare to do so. And I want to move quickly into the Coast Guard, because the Coast Guard was created by Alexander Hamilton. It actually started out as a revenue cutter service. The Coast Guard wasn't established until 1915. But the Coast Guard, even though we are not in declared war, is coming out and saying that it is a special branch of military and that it somehow comes under. It has moved from the Department of Transportation, where it resided since 1967, and you don't put a branch of military in the Department of Transportation. In 2003, March 1st, 2003, from the Patriot Act, Homeland Security Act, Executive Order 13228 that established the Department of Homeland Security. A year later, Congress came out and passed the legislation to create the department. On March 1st, 2003, though, the Coast Guard was moved into the Department of Homeland Security. When it did, it has tried to not only commandeer the Federal Emergency Management Agency from the fiasco with Michael Brown. Admiral Allen took over FEMA, moved it into the Department of Homeland Security. And one needs to be clear that initially the Department of Homeland Security was to be called the Department of Homeland Defense. And the problem there is it would be abundantly clear to people that we would have two defense departments. Without actually renaming it, the Department of Defense has become once again the Department of War that we had in World War II. It is being used for aggressive wars, not just in Afghanistan and Iraq, but there are many games going on in Asia and South America. And if you begin to read some of these books that I mentioned, not only Philip Bobbitt's book, but also Naomi Klein, Naomi Wolf, Chalmers Johnson, Jeremy Scahill, he wrote Blackwater. And when you start to read all of these texts and start to put the pieces of the puzzle together, we are so far down that slippery slope to militarizing everything in our country and doing so under Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, Admiralty and control of the military forces, to where President Bush wants to bring everything under control of the military. And right now, and that's why I bring up the Coast Guard, because it's a very good study. The Coast Guard is and was created as a civil agency, a police law enforcement agency for maritime policing of pollution, the fisheries, smuggling, piracy, et cetera, et cetera. Since 2003, the Coast Guard has carried on a very strong program of propaganda declaring that it is a special branch of military that can carry on and violate posse comitatus. Posse comitatus was enacted in 1872 to prevent the military from being used as a police force. It is not intended for that. It is a defense force. And we pay those dollars to protect us all, not just a select group here in the United States. And instead, the Coast Guard is not only levying taxes as a branch of military upon civilians, which is a violation of the Third Amendment, and that came actually in response to our founding fathers enacted the Third Amendment because of what Napoleon was doing in Europe. He was using his own troops to go through the countryside and to survive, to allow them to forage off of the local townfolk and take food out of their cupboards, food off of their table, sleep in their houses, and impose themselves upon the citizens of whatever area they would find themselves in. And the Third Amendment was passed to prevent this here in the United States, but now we have the Coast Guard, which is a branch of military imposing, levying taxes against civilians, whether they're willing or whether they're voluntary or not. They're not supposed to be, a branch of military is not supposed to be imposing taxes upon civilians. They are collecting taxes from civilians as well as a branch of military. And this money is, it is said that it is actually being put in the general fund, but at some point, whether it's being put in the general fund or the Coast Guard is pocketing the money, if it goes into the general fund, it is still helping pay for the Coast Guard. So you have a branch of military, a self-declared branch of military, now not only imposing taxes, collecting taxes, but using those taxes around the oversight of Congress to fund a special branch of military. The way the system was set up was for the Coast Guard in a time of declared war to move under the Department of Navy. And the reason for this is that in times of peace, it is a civilian law enforcement agency. And although it is organized, and this is one of the arguments they put out going back to the law from, or it was actually an executive order that initially created the Coast Guard in 1915, and it brought together the Lighthouse Saving Service, or the Lighthouse Service, excuse me, the Life Saving Service and the Revenue Cutter Marine into one service. And the reason for this was the evident evidence showing, or that we were approaching World War I, and that's why the Coast Guard was actually created, to bring it all together, and also to bring it under, even though it was formed under a military form of organization, the Cub Scouts, the Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts, the police, and I'll stop there. They all have uniforms. They don't have guns, and they're not a police force. But the police have uniforms. They are organized upon military lines. They have lieutenants, they have captains, they have sergeants, and more. They have weapons, and some of the police not only have the assault vehicles with the SWAT systems that they have and the SWAT teams that they have, they're pretty well armed. Even in New York, I think there's as many as 30,000 when you include Port Authority and other authorities or police law enforcement agencies in New York. It gets up over 30,000 people. That's a small army. The Coast Guard is 40,000 plus strong. They're looking to grow this now and use it as almost a public sector Blackwater that can be used to not only impose taxes, carry on police law enforcement, but also to carry on trials, military trials in back rooms for police enforcement. So you have the Coast Guard not only legislating because they're creating many of these regulations and laws, rules themselves and doing it internally. They're also the executive branch, where they are the quote-unquote police enforcement, and they are also the judiciary. They have been carrying on trials of federal maritime officers, not just of our own country, but others, within these military tribunals, and they are set up along the Military Commissions Act. And what is going on is many of these individuals are civilians, and they're being dragged before military tribunals that they have no idea what they're going into. And under, like I mentioned, not only Napoleon and Bismarck, but under Napoleonic law, which is military law, you are presumed guilty. And they are expanding this program, which is a danger to not only civil rights, but constitutional order. And you hear they want to and are using NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, the World Trade Organization, IMF, and other organizations, international organizations, to dissolve the United States, to dissolve the constitutional order, to use war, just like in not only World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and many that we've had before or in between, like smaller quote-unquote police activities like in Panama and Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador. You can go on through the list. And now, most recently, in Afghanistan and Iraq, and they are using the United States being under a declared war to change the constitutional order from underneath, from the underbelly, so that at some point people do not realize what is going on. And we're going to get more into the Coast Guard. We have another show coming up right after this, and we will talk more about the Coast Guard, what the Coast Guard is up to, not only in just levying taxes, imposing taxes, carrying on military tribunals, how the Coast Guard got to this position, and it's just going to be quick key points about who and what the Coast Guard is today and how it has devolved into this situation where it considers itself to be a special branch of military. Thank you.
Questions of much graver and universal interest occupy our minds today.